If you are a traditional quilter, you probably like to do precision piecing where all the points line up and it looks great. This goal is not only very difficult in pojagi patchwork, it's also not recommended. Welcome to Evita Studio. My name is Elizabeth, and today I'm going to be talking all about seam allowances. So if you've been sewing for any amount of time, you're probably familiar with seam allowances. And the seam allowance is the part of the fabric that is on the inside of whatever you're sewing. It's beyond where you're stitching, and it usually doesn't show on the right side. Now there are some standards in sewing. So in quilting, the standard seam allowance is 1/4 of an inch. So you stitch 1/4 of an inch away from the edge of the fabric. In dressmaking, there are some different standards, but it's usually 5/8 of an inch or 1/2 an inch, something in that ballpark. But when it comes to modern pojagi, seam allowances are a totally different thing. So if you're a quilter and you want to try this method of reversible patchwork, take everything you know about seam allowances and throw it out the window. So this piece is put together with just the traditional quilting seam allowances. They're each 1/4 of an inch, and these pieces were cut at 2.5 inches. So now when they're joined together, you can see that the 2.5 inches becomes 2 inches finished. There's 1/4 inch in this seam allowance and 1/4 inch in this seam allowance. So the 2.5 subtract 1/2, you get 2 inches. So this will be really familiar to any quilters. But these fabric pieces are put together using pojagi seam allowances. So there are a few different things. The pojagi seam allowances are totally reversible, so there is no inside. They are included in the width. They are also not consistent. So these 4 pieces were also cut at 2.5 inches wide. But here you can see this light pink piece was 2.5 inches, and now it's 1 3/4 is what you see. This dark pink was 2.5, but here you can see it's under 1.5. But on the other side, this dark pink piece that was under 1.5 is 2 inches. And on this light pink, it is 1 1/4, the same as it was on the other side, but it is shifted over a bit. So you can see that it's just a different creature. This will have a big impact on how you stitch things together. One other thing is that these seam allowances are not all perfectly equal in size. They're all approximately 1/4 of an inch, but some might be a tiny bit smaller than 1/4 of an inch, and some might be a tiny bit larger than 1/4 of an inch. And that is perfectly fine. With this method, it's very difficult to try and get an exact seam allowance. With most projects, it's not worth the stress that would be involved. So because the seams are totally different creatures, that really impacts how we have to put things together. So if you have a pojagi pattern and you're trying to figure out how come your pieces don't line up, then these tips will probably help with that. So this is a piece from the Gradient Panels window hanging, and these pieces are joined in little sections. So these 2 pieces would be joined together with the pojagi seam there. And these 2 pieces would be joined with the pojagi seam there. But then when this section is going to be joined to this section, they might not be exactly the same length. So one of them might need to be trimmed. So in this case, I would join these 2 pieces and then trim both the top and bottom edges so that it lines up. Then when you're going to join this section to this piece, this might not be the exact same length. So join this together and then trim these two sides so that it has straight sides and they're the same length. So that's the way you work on a pattern. You join the small pieces, and then each time you join it to something else, you'll have to trim the sides so that they're straight edges, and they may not be exactly the same length as what you're going to be joining it to. So because of the method that we have to use in joining, that is why pojagi has the kind of improv modern feel to it. In pojagi seams, there is a lot of layers of fabric, and that is what actually gives it the stained glass effect when it's hanging in the window. It's because the light comes through the single layer of fabric, but it doesn't come through the seams because there's so many layers of fabric. So if you have a section like here where there's multiple seams crossing each other, you could end up with 8 or 12 layers of fabric together. So it's actually easier if you avoid that than to try and get it. In this section, you can see that these two pieces seem like they overlap. But if you turn and look at the same spot on the reverse, then you can see there that the points don't match at all, even though the seams match. Because of the way the seams lay, the corners of the yellow pieces don't match. This is fine. That is just the nature of the pojagi patchwork. So it is possible to try and get all the corners to line up on both sides and get everything to match, but I don't recommend it at all. It's very frustrating, and it also gives so much bulk in the fabric seams. So once you understand how the seam allowances are different and you stop trying to apply quilting rules to these kind of seams, it actually becomes really relaxing and enjoyable. You don't have to stress about an exact 1/4 inch seam. Close enough is really good. Usually the width of your presser foot is just a nice length that you can use. And also the style of piecing that looks improvisational and modern. That is really fun and relaxing to do because there's no stressing for perfection. So even if you are a traditional quilter and you'd love to do precision piecing where everything matches, I would encourage you to try some pojagi patchwork. Don't be stressed out about trying to get things to line up or look perfect. Just relax and enjoy the process. You can find tutorials and patterns that use this technique at evadestudio.com.